Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi everybody, welcome to Unbound Season 3. I'm Beth Curry and I'm not messing around today. This is episode 2. This is chapter 2 in the book, Smile Pretty for the Church People. If school was where I learned to be small, church was where I learned to be seen, but only in the right ways. Sunday mornings were different in our house. There was an energy, a purpose that the other 6 days didn't have. My mom would be up early, curling her hair and humming hymns while she got ready. My dad would fix his tie one more time before we left. And me? I got to be part of something bigger. Walking into that sanctuary after 5 days of being too much at school felt like stepping into a warm bath. The tension I didn't even know I was carrying would melt from my shoulders the moment I heard Mrs. Sims call my name and slip me a peppermint from her purse. Here, adults smiled when they saw me coming instead of sighing. Here, kids actually wanted to sit next to me during children's church. Here, asking questions didn't automatically make me the problem. Well, not at first anyway. I loved everything about our church. The smell of coffee brewing in the fellowship hall, the way sunlight painted rainbows through the windows, the Christmas pageants where I got to be a bit player and sing Christmas songs in the children's choir. The building felt solid and safe, brick and wooden siding, brown steeple, a place where good things happened to good people. My parents weren't the pastor or deacons or anything that official, but they were everywhere. Mom's voice soaring in the choir loft during How Great Thou Art, Dad adjusting the microphone levels in the sound room upstairs and making sure the pastor's voice carried to the back row. Later, when I was older, Dad would spend several days a week organizing food donations, turning our church into a lifeline for families who needed help putting dinner on the table. We were part of the fabric of this place, and I was proud of that. But even in paradise, there were rules. Sunday school was my favorite hour of the week. No parents, just us kids and teachers who genuinely seemed to enjoy being there. Mrs. Peterson taught my class from kindergarten through second grade. And she was the kind of teacher who made Bible stories come alive. She'd act out David facing Goliath, complete with sound effects, and we'd all gasp like we didn't know how it ended. I was the kid in the front row, hand shooting up before she'd even finished the question. I knew all the Bible stories, could recite memory verses like I was performing Shakespeare, and had strong opinions about pretty much everything we discussed. The problem was, my opinions didn't always match the lesson plan. Mrs. Peterson, I said one Sunday, probably 6 years old and far too confident for my own good. If Jesus said to love our enemies, why did God tell the Israelites to kill all those people in the Old Testament? The room went quiet. Mrs. Peterson's smile got a little tighter. But I wasn't asking to be difficult. I was asking because I lay awake at night thinking about this stuff. Because if God was love, really truly love, then how could he also be the God who drowned the whole world except for one family? How could the same God who said, "Thou shalt not kill," also command armies to wipe out entire cities? I needed it to make sense. I needed these stories to fit together into something that wouldn't keep me staring at my bedroom ceiling, wondering if the God I was supposed to love was actually someone I should be afraid of. Well, sweetie, that's a very grown-up question. Sometimes God's ways are hard for us to understand. But I wasn't satisfied with that. I never was. But if killing is wrong, how can it sometimes be right? And if God doesn't change, why did he change his mind about killing? Now the other kids were staring. Some of them looked confused, like they'd never thought about it before. Others looked annoyed that I was complicating story time with my questions. One girl actually rolled her eyes. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. Why don't we talk about how David trusted God even when facing the giant? That's the real lesson today. I knew a subject change when I heard one. But the questions didn't go away just because she moved on to the coloring sheet. They never did. The car ride home was where I learned that even good questions could be problems. Mrs. Peterson mentioned you had some interesting thoughts during class today, Mom would say, her voice carefully neutral as she glanced at me. I was just wondering. I know, honey, but we need to be more mindful about how we ask questions in front of the other children. Some of those kids might not be ready for such complicated ideas. Their parents aren't thrilled when they come home asking about genocide. Genocide. She actually used that word to me at 6 years old, which meant she knew exactly what I was getting at, and she knew it was a problem. What she meant was, you're making the other parents uncomfortable, and they're talking to me about it. Again. Dad, who I think I got this problem from, would jump in from the driver's seat trying to play peacemaker. It's wonderful that you're thinking so deeply about these things. Maybe we can explore them at home instead of during class time. What he meant was, please stop making Mrs. Peterson call us. She's running out of diplomatic ways to say your daughter is disrupting Sunday school. The message was clear. My curiosity was okay in private, in small doses, when it didn't disrupt the lesson or confuse the other kids or make adults squirm in their folding chairs. But that was the thing about my brain. It didn't have an off switch. The questions came whether I wanted them to or not, and they always seemed to come at exactly the wrong moment. By the time I was 8 or 9, I'd developed a reputation. Not a bad one, exactly, but definitely a noticeable one. Oh, you're Dave and Kathy's daughter, new Sunday school teachers would say when they met me, and there was always something in their tone, a kind of careful brightness. I've heard you ask very thoughtful questions, which was church speak for I've been warned about you. But the beautiful thing about church people, the real ones, not the performers, they actually tried to answer me. They'd stay after class sometimes, digging through commentaries and concordances, trying to help me understand why Lot's daughters did what they did, or how Noah fit all those animals in the ark, or why Job's friends were such incredible assholes. Okay, they didn't use that word, but I definitely thought it. Mrs. Roberts, who taught a later Sunday school class, was different from the others. She didn't get flustered when I asked hard questions. Instead, she'd lean forward like she was genuinely interested in what I was thinking. What do you think about that? She'd ask back. How do you think God felt in that moment? She made me feel like my questions mattered, like wondering about difficult things wasn't a character flaw, but a sign that I was actually paying attention, like maybe God appreciated my curiosity instead of being annoyed by it. I loved her for that. But even Mrs. Roberts had limits. You know, she said one Sunday after I'd spent 15 minutes dissecting the parable of the workers in the vineyard and insisting it wasn't fair that people who worked all day got paid the same as people who worked 1 hour. Your parents might enjoy hearing some of these questions too. Some of them are really more for family discussion. Her smile was kind, but her meaning was clear. You're going over my head, kid, and I don't want to accidentally teach you something your parents wouldn't approve of. The thing was, I wasn't trying to be difficult. I wasn't trying to stump the teachers or show off how much I knew. I was genuinely trying to understand how this God we sang about every week actually worked. If he was love, why was there so much fear in the Bible? If he was just, why did bad things happen to good people? If he answered prayers, why didn't he answer mine when I prayed every single night for the kids at school to stop calling me weird? These weren't rebellious questions. They were desperate ones. Because I loved this place. I loved the people. I loved the idea of a God who knew every hair on my head and loved me no matter what. But I needed it to make sense. I needed the pieces to fit together in a way that didn't leave me lying awake at night, wondering if I was missing something crucial, wondering if my inability to just accept things meant there was something fundamentally wrong with me. My parents tried to help, bless them. Sunday afternoons often turned into impromptu theology sessions at our kitchen table with Dad and Mom trying to explain concepts that seminary students struggled with. But there was always this undercurrent of tone it down at church. Not because my questions were wrong, but because other people weren't comfortable with them. Because church was supposed to feel safe and simple, and my questions made it feel complicated and messy. I was learning another version of the same lesson I'd learned in kindergarten. Even when you're in a place that loves you, your voice can still be too much. 5th grade was when everything started to change. I'd been begging for braces for months. My teeth were crooked enough the kids at school started making comments, and I was convinced that straight teeth would solve at least some of my problems. Finally, something I could fix. Something that would make me look more normal, more acceptable. Mom finally agreed, and I was over the moon. I was so excited to have a mouthful of metal, imagining how sophisticated I'd look, how confident I'd feel. Finally, something that would make me fit in better instead of standing out for all the wrong reasons. Hilarious. The orthodontist was nice enough. explained the process, showed me before and after pictures of other kids, promised it would only take about 2 years. I barely felt the pain of getting them put on. I was too excited about the results. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Better than perfect. I felt older, more grown up, like I was finally taking control of something about my appearance. Even the soreness felt worth it when I caught my reflection in mirrors and saw that metal gleaming against my teeth like a badge of maturity. But then my skin started itching. Just a little at first, dry patches on my arms that I figured were from the weather changing. Nothing to worry about. Then more patches. Then patches that got red and angry looking, raised bumps that felt hot to the touch. Then patches that started spreading. It's probably just eczema, Mum said, buying special soap and lotion from the pharmacy. You'll grow out of it. I had it when I was your age. But I didn't grow out of it. I grew into it. By the end of 5th grade, the patches had taken over. My arms looked like they'd been burned, covered in angry red scales that cracked and bled when I moved. My legs were worse. My face, had red, flaky patches around my eyes and mouth that made me look like I had some kind of contagious disease. I was so swollen. My scalp itched so badly, I'd scratch until my stubby fingernails, which I bit because of anxiety, came away bloody, leaving scabs that flaked off onto my shoulders like the world's most disgusting dandruff. I stopped looking in mirrors, stopped wearing short sleeves, even when it was 90 degrees outside. Started sitting in the back of the classroom so people couldn't stare at the mess I'd become. The dermatologist was baffled. "We'll try this cream," she'd say, prescribing something else that didn't work. Maybe it's stress. Maybe it's diet. Maybe it's just one of those things kids go through. None of us connected it to the braces. Why would we? They were just metal brackets, something thousands of kids had without any problems. We had no idea I was allergic to the nickel in the metal. Had no idea that my immune system was attacking itself, trying to fight off something that was permanently attached to my teeth. We had no idea that this would go on for years, getting worse and worse until I looked like a completely different person. All I knew was that the thing I thought would make me more acceptable had turned me into a monster. And the one place I'd always felt safe, church, where kids were kind and adults were patient with my questions, was about to become much more complicated. The last Sunday before 6th grade started, I sat in my usual spot during children's church, wearing long sleeves even though it was August, trying not to scratch the patches on my face. Mrs. Roberts was telling the story of Moses, how God used him even though he didn't think he was good enough, even though he had flaws. "God doesn't care what we look like on the outside," she said, her eyes kind and earnest. "He cares about our hearts." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But I also knew that people weren't God. And people definitely cared what you looked like. Even church people, even good people, even people who are supposed to love you, no matter what. Because I'd seen the way little kids stared at my arms when I forgot to pull my sleeves down. I'd noticed how quickly conversations stopped when adults caught sight of my face. I'd felt the subtle shift in how people interacted with me. Still kind, still loving, but with a careful distance that hadn't been there before. I was about to find out just how much appearance mattered, even in the place where it wasn't supposed to matter at all. The girl who asked too many questions was about to become the girl who looked too different. And in a world where being different was already dangerous, looking different was going to be catastrophic. 6th grade was starting in 3 days, and I was terrified. What's actually true? Faith built on questions is stronger than faith built on silence, but too many religious spaces teach us that doubt is dangerous, that curiosity is disrespectful, that spiritual questions should be whispered rather than voiced. When children's theological wondering is shut down with "God's ways are higher than our ways," or "some things are better left alone," we don't just lose their questions, we lose their authentic relationship with the divine. A faith that can't withstand a child's honest curiosity isn't much of a faith at all. Real spiritual growth happens in the questions, not in the comfortable answers. When we silence spiritual curiosity, we don't protect faith. We protect the people who benefit from unquestioned authority. What spiritual question have you been afraid to ask out loud? What doubt have you been ashamed to acknowledge? Right now, give voice to one thing that you've wondered about but been told it's inappropriate to question. Your spiritual curiosity is not disrespectful, it's sacred. permission slip. I give myself permission to question religious authority. I give myself permission to doubt what doesn't feel true in my soul. I give myself permission to seek my own authentic relationship with the divine, even if it looks different from what I was taught. My spiritual journey belongs to me, not to the people who want to control it. I am allowed to question my faith. I am allowed to doubt what doesn't serve me. I am allowed to seek truth even when it makes others uncomfortable. I am allowed to have my own relationship with the divine. Your spiritual curiosity is a gift, not a threat. This week, voice one spiritual question you've been carrying in silence, whether to a trusted friend, in a journal, or in prayer. Give that wondering a voice. Notice what happens when you honor your spiritual curiosity instead of silencing it. Okay, so as I sit with this chapter, what strikes me most, and I've said this before, I keep saying this over and over again, all the livelong day, is how early we learn the art of emotional shape-shifting, not intentionally, not manipulatively, but more as kind of a survival skill, especially in environments that are supposed to feel safe. Childhood teaches this to us. It's very quiet choreography, if you will. Be small here, be bright here, be agreeable here, don't ask too much there. And I guess by the time we're old enough to name it, the pattern is already kind of baked into the foundation, right? There's a psychological phenomenon called performative belonging. Don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It's where a child learns to earn connection rather than receive it. And churches and schools, families, any kind of tight-knit community with clear norms can unintentionally foster that. You start showing the version of yourself that gets the warm smiles and the peppermint candies, the "we're so proud of yous," and you learn to hide the parts that make people shift in their seats. Something I learned about safe spaces, they're only safe as long as you follow the unspoken guidelines. Every community, even the loving ones, has boundaries around what's acceptable. But the trick is figuring out whether those boundaries protect the community or just protect the people in power. If you've ever felt like you've had to perform a certain version of yourself to belong somewhere, anywhere, even somewhere you loved, you know this tension very well. What's fascinating to me is that, kids aren't confused about belonging. Adults are. Kids know instantly when they're accepted versus when they're tolerated. They can read those micro reactions better than probably any body language expert. So when a room responds to your enthusiasm one way and then your curiosity to another way, your brain starts kind of creating these categories, right? Safe self, unsafe self, allowable self, silence required self. And the kicker is many adults don't really ever revisit those categories. We grow up, but the rules that we internalized at 6 or 7 or 8 years old still kind of keep running the show. And that's one thing that the chapter touches on beneath the surface is the way we communicate or the way communities handle difference. Not difference that's disruptive, just difference that's not predictable, Religion tends to idealize certainty, so anything that introduces ambiguity feels threatening, even if it's coming from a child who just wants to understand the universe, If you were a kid that asked the hard questions, just like I was, about faith or morality or authority, you probably are very familiar with the feeling. You were probably nodding while you were listening to me yammer on during the chapter. The moment when you kind of realize because God said so or because that's how we've always done it, isn't actually an answer at all. It's not an answer. Your questions were never disrespectful. They were just signs of a mind that was actually engaging with the material instead of just accepting it. Critical thinking is not the enemy of faith at all. Blind obedience is. And there's a term for that too, cognitive dissonance avoidance. So when a question might destabilize a worldview, the easiest way to handle it is to avoid the question or avoid the person asking it. Not cruelly and not intentionally, just instinctively. We just kind of back off or pull away or whatever. Communities manage uncertainty the way that the human body manages allergens, sometimes by overreacting. And that's something we don't talk about enough too. And kids who ask deep questions aren't challenging God, they're challenging adults' sense of control, if that makes sense. That's what makes religious questions feel dangerous to some people. It's not really theology, it's authority. What I understand now about adults who shut down children's spiritual questions, they're often operating from their own fear. Fear that maybe they don't know the answers, or that the questioning might lead to doubt. Fear that if they can't explain God in those kind of neat, simple terms, maybe their own faith isn't as solid as they thought. Your questions weren't threatening their God, neither were mine. They were threatening their certainty. And sometimes people would rather silence questions than examine their own beliefs. As an adult, I have learned it is actually okay to look at somebody and say, I don't know. And this is where I learned one of my first lessons in emotional labor. It was my job to manage other people's comfort with my thoughts, not their job to expand their thinking to accommodate mine. If you've ever been told you're too much or too intense, or that you should save those questions for later or whatever, you're very familiar with this. You're not too much. The people who can't handle your depth are just operating in shallow water. If you grew up in a religious environment where questions were discouraged, where doubt was treated as a weakness instead of a sign of growth, I want you to know that a faith that can't withstand questions is not a faith at all. Your spiritual curiosity wasn't a threat to God. It was you trying to have a real relationship with God instead of just following scripts. The people who told you to stop asking questions were protecting their own comfort, not your soul. What I love about this chapter is how it shows both sides, the people who welcomed the curiosity and the people who felt threatened by it, because that's real. That duality is everywhere, Most spiritual communities are a mix of please don't disrupt the lesson plan and tell me everything you're wondering. This matters. Both exist under the same roof, absolutely. But the deeper layer, when belonging becomes conditional, even subtly, a kid learns that their value is tied to how comfortable they make other people. And this plays out later in adulthood in ways that people never connect back to childhood, like overthinking every email to avoid sounding difficult, or shrinking opinions around people who seem easily overwhelmed, apologizing for simply having an experience, assuming the discomfort means that you've done something wrong, maybe hiding the messier, complex parts of yourself, or learning to be palatable instead of being whole. Make sense? People think these traits appear out of nowhere, but they don't. They're learned in places where acceptance came with fine print. What also stands out is the moment that the body enters the story too, right? Like body changes, health issues, visible differences, they introduce a whole new layer of identity negotiation. There's an entire field of psychology called appearance-based social anxiety. And it's not vanity. It's like this self-protective vigilance learned in environments where looking different carried a cost. And that cost doesn't have to be bullying or cruelty. Sometimes it's just subtle withdrawal or quiet discomfort of the sense of being other. Sometimes our bodies rebel against things that seem harmless on the surface. And sometimes what looks like it should help us actually hurts us. And sometimes the cure becomes the poison. If you've ever had your body turn against itself or felt betrayed by the vessel you live in, you know this confusion. Your body's not broken, though. It's trying to protect you from something, even when that something is supposed to be helping, right? Trust what your body's telling you, even when the experts can't explain it. And the part that so many people, especially former church kids, will resonate with, communities that preach unconditional love rarely account for the human reflex to react to what feels unfamiliar. Not maliciously, just humanly. Hard truth about conditional love. It's everywhere, even in places that preach unconditional acceptance. People can love your heart while still being uncomfortable with your exterior. They can believe that God doesn't care what you look like while still treating you differently when you don't look the way they expect. This isn't about them being bad people. It's just about humans being human, but it still hurts like hell when you're the one experiencing it. If you've ever been loved in theory, but rejected in practice, you know this pain. And there's a grief in that. It's a grief that kids don't even have words for, right? It feels like I didn't do anything wrong. I just changed. And for a child, that's devastating. This chapter is also an entry point into something deeper. The spiritual injury that happens when a kid believes that their natural curiosity or natural body makes them spiritually inconvenient. Not unworthy, just complicated. And in environments where simplicity is prized, complicated can feel like a problem for sure. Many adults carry that wound into their 30s and 40s and 50s. The wound of feeling like you're too much for the very places that you wanted to belong the most. So the reflection I want to offer after this chapter, where did you first learn to edit yourself for connection? And what part of you is still living by that old rule? Because what childhood teaches for survival, adulthood, it often keeps out of muscle memory. There's another version of you, the unfiltered, untangled, unanxious version who still exists beneath all that training, the one who asked the questions fearlessly and the one who believed belonging didn't require performance. The one who felt safe enough to be curious and expressive and imperfect. That version didn't disappear at all. It just kind of went underground. Part of healing, part of reclaiming your own story is letting that version come back to the surface, even in the small ways, even in the quiet ways, even in ways that only you notice at first. Because curiosity is not rebellion. Authenticity is not disruption, and difference was never the problem. Silencing yourself to keep the peace, that's the thing that was never meant to be holy. Thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to follow me wherever you listen to me. So when new episodes come out, you'll be notified. Remember that all episodes of Unbound are free. If you want to support the production costs, all the support and contact info is in the show notes, but the content will always be free because I don't think barriers to healing should be financial. The support and contact info in the show notes. And if you join the Facebook group, we sometimes have further conversation there on individual episodes, as well as giveaways and other fun things mentioned in off-script episodes. So that's it for today. I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.